We're coming to you today from Wurundjeri country, but recognising that our participants today are sited all over Australia and elsewhere. In the spirit of reconciliation, Food Frontier acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. Well, I'm very pleased that you're joining us for this webinar. For those of you engaging with us for the first time, very briefly, Food Frontier is a not-for-profit independent think tank focused on the potential of alternative proteins to unlock economic, environmental and health benefits. We are completely independent, and as such our work is made possible by the generosity of our donors. We will begin today with a summary of our recently published State of the Industry report for the plant-based meat industry and offer you some insights and commentary from its principal author, Clara Colachoy, our Head of Research Strategy, who happens to have just returned from the Netherlands, where she was presenting at Bridge to Food in The Hague and getting a good idea of what's happening with plant-based meat on the other side of the world. Following that, we have a very special guest, Adam Moore, a well-known corporate executive chef. Adam will be joined by our Head of Industry Engagement, Susie O'Neill, who will host the chat with Adam and tease out some of his extensive strategic insights. I'll let Susie introduce you to more of Adam's impressive credentials when we get to that part of the presentation. Finally, there's an opportunity for more general Q&A based on both the presentation and Adam's chat. So please enter your questions via the chat function as and when they occur to you, and we'll get to those after the presentations. And I'm sure you've noted and possibly downloaded the SOI report, of which this webinar is based. There is also a smaller report which looks forward to the next decade for the industry, with a number of projection scenarios that were developed for us by Deloitte Access Economics. Clara's going to touch on that over the next hour. But it's also, this whole presentation is going to be available, the presentation is available on our website, but also this whole presentation is being recorded, and we'll let you know how we will disseminate that recording for an opportunity for you to review that at a later date. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Clara.
Thanks, Simon. Hi, everyone. As Simon mentioned, my name is Clara, and I'm Head of Research Strategy at Food Frontier. I've been at Food Frontier since the start of 2020, which means I've seen a lot of change and progress in the world of alternative protein since I started working in this space. I manage and lead the organization's knowledge function, including the publications and reports that we offer to our stakeholders. And of course, that includes the most recent State of the Industry report. Before I take you through the findings, I want to run through some of the background info and explain the report's inclusion and exclusion so you can be sure of exactly what we are speaking about today. So the report is focused on the plant-based meat market in Australia. It updates on the data that was previously included in our last State of the Industry report, which covered financial year 2020, and it also includes new data points. But frequently throughout the presentation, I'll be referring to FY20 because that is the last time that we undertook this report and made these measurements. So in the report, the economic data relates to financial year 2023, whereas the industry updates relate to 2021 to 2023. And that reason for that is just anything that was published after our last State of the Industry report. If it was of major consequence, we tried to include it into the report if it didn't fall within that specific FY timeframe. The economic data relates to the Australian plant-based meat industry specifically, whilst the industry updates are both at a global and a local level, and they are split into different chapters to make it easy for you to navigate. To undertake the economic contribution analysis, we again partnered with the experts at Deloitte Access Economics, whilst Food Frontier undertook around 20 one-on-one consultations with industry to help inform the report and our recommendations. And if anyone who joined one of those consultations is on the line today, I do want to thank you again for participating in this report progress. The report also shares the unique insights from Food Frontier's proprietary data sets on price, products, companies, and brands. And we have those records dating back to 2020. So it's a really rich data set that we were able to overlay into this report. And then obviously the report and of course this presentation, we couldn't include every single thing in the report today or in the presentation today. So if there's something that you want clarification on, feel free to reach out to us in future, as we're always happy to chat. Now let's jump into the data. So plant-based meat sales. The report found that the plant-based meat industry is experiencing overall total sales growth, but uneven success across retail and food service sectors. So although retail sales are currently still higher than wholesale food service sales, we expect that to change in coming years, as the report found that category growth was largely being driven by wholesale food service sales, and these experienced a 59% compound annual growth rate since FY20. Now, in terms of retail sales, there was a contraction of 1.1% year on year since FY20. Now, it's really important to contextualize this point. A 1% contraction in retail sales is actually a much stronger result than what we've seen in other international markets, such as the US, which saw a negative 12% decline in plant-based meat sales in retail. And so what this really demonstrates is that the Australian industry is charting its own course. And so despite the sensationalist media headlines and messaging that we might see that the plant-based meat industry is in a worldwide decline, that's really not the case. So those media articles are generally focused on one particular company's stock price, or they're written from a US perspective. And whilst consumer uptake has been slower than expected, since FY20 in Australia, plant-based meat sales have increased a total of 47%, which is a 13.8% compound annual growth rate year on year. And so that certainly tells a different story to those media headlines that we might be seeing a lot of. So it's worth putting Australia's experience into the global context, and I can do that thanks to GFI for sharing this data with us. So as you can see here, the more mature markets like the EU and North America are entering a period of plateau or consolidation, while newer markets such as Latin America, Middle East and North Africa and Asia Pacific are still experiencing growth. Taking a moment for consumption and production. So annual per capita consumption of plant-based meat increased 28% in total since FY20, and that's a 9.1% compound annual growth rate. Per capita expenditure increased from $8.40 to $10.20. And while that might seem like a small amount, when you consider that the majority of Australians aren't purchasing plant-based meat regularly, the per capita expenditure figure really increases when you consider the population of those that are purchasing plant-based meat. And in terms of production of the plant-based meat products on shelves in retail in Australia, 63% of those are made by Australian plant-based meat brands. Here we have the data from Deloitte's economic contribution analysis for the plant-based meat industry in Australia. Importantly, Deloitte found that the agriculture sector was the largest indirect beneficiary, receiving 21% share of total indirect economic contribution and a 32% share of total indirect employment contributions. So one of the reasons for this is that the agriculture sector, as Deloitte defined it, captures the economic activity from plant protein ingredients and the processing of those. So it's not just a figure relating to on-farm activity. And for those that are really interested in this figure and this data in detail, we do have a lot more graphs and figures in the report for you to take a look at. Now, if we look at the contribution broken down by state, we can see that manufacturing production is concentrated on the eastern states, and that echoes the geographic footsteps of Australia's traditional food manufacturing sector. With new manufacturing capacity coming online in Queensland and a production facility closing down in Wodonga, Victoria during the financial year 2023, Queensland has now overtaken Victoria for enjoying the second highest share of economic contribution. In terms of exports, Australia's export opportunity continues to grow, growing from 5 companies exporting plant-based meats in FY20 to 9 in FY23. Australian plant-based meat manufacturers are now exporting to more than 20 different markets, with the majority of products going to countries in Asia Pacific. Now I want to speak a bit about price. We know that price is a key barrier for increased consumer consumption, and that the plant-based meat products generally are more expensive than conventional animal meat products. What our price analysis found is that the price premium for plant-based meat products is actually reduced over time. So in FY20, the price premium was 49%, and FY23, it was 33%. I think that's a really big achievement given the economic climate and inflationary environment that they are operating in. Now, our analysis of products and price in December 2023 found that per kilo, Australian-made plant-based meat products are on average 15% more affordable than imported products. So we can see that Australian products on average are sitting around the $25 mark, and we can see that imported products are around 28 or 29, closer to $29 per kilo. So some of the reasons for this include the relative weakness of the Australian dollar against international currencies, the fact that imported products tend to be frozen, which requires cold chain logistics and transport below 18 degrees, which is more expensive to operate than a chilled transport, and the fact that these products are generally imported to Australia via distributors or other intermediaries rather than directly by the companies themselves, which also increases the cost for the consumer. Another point on price is the changes over time. So here I have the details of a graph in the report from figure 11, which looks better when we display it. This is a few key pullouts here, but we tracked price from December 2021 to December 2023. And we can see that as a category, plant-based meat products increased in price an average of 7.4%. At the same time, prices of conventional meat and seafood increased around 8%. So whilst the formats of some plant-based meat products experienced significant price increases across the 2-year period, and these were formats such as sausages and bacon, others remained stable or even decreased. And so beef-style strips and chunks and minced products experienced average price reductions of 10% and 5.3% respectively. Our consultation with industry showed that many Australian plant-based meat products have made efforts to avoid price increases and instead aim to lower the cost of their products, with minced products being a primary focus due to its familiarity to consumers and its versatility across multiple cuisines. We know that everyone has a reliable mince recipe that they know how to cook. So acknowledging that price is a key barrier to consumer uptake, these Australian manufacturers explained that where possible, they were trying to absorb price increases, or they improved efficiencies in their supply chains, and while others worked to vertically integrate their operations to reduce overall costs. Now, this is the plant-based version of the company map. At the time of publishing the report, there were 22 companies producing products under 28 different brands. During FY23, there were actually 23 companies, but we did see a merger at the end of 2023 between 2 Australian companies who looked to consolidate their position in the market, and we can potentially expect to see that continue this year as well. The change since the 2020 report is that in FY20, there were 19 Australian companies producing products under 23 different brands. So there has been an overall increase. Additionally, Food Frontier updates and publishes a company directory listing the Australian alternative proteins companies at various points throughout the year. So you can head to our website and download the most recent version of that document if you would like the details of the companies in the wider alternative proteins ecosystem and not just the plant-based companies. Now, food service. I mentioned earlier that food service was the biggest area for growth in plant-based meat in Australia, and that wholesale food service sales experienced a 59% compound annual growth rate since 2020. So the sales were 31 million in FY20 to 123.6 million in FY23. And what's really interesting to note is that the plant-based meat industry still has lots of room to grow in the food service sector. So according to Food Industry Foresight, in the commercial food service sector, QSRs, quick service restaurants, represented 80% of the volume of plant-based meat sales in 2022. This demonstrates strong potential for growth in other commercial segments, such as cafes and full-service restaurants, as well as in institutional food service settings, and that's settings like aged care, hospitals, correctional, educational facilities. Now, agriculture and plant-based meats. So Australia's expertise in wheat and protein-rich grains and pulses positions it well to meet the growing demands for consistently high quality and traceable plant protein ingredients. Importantly, every single plant-based meat company that I consulted with for the report expressed a keen desire to include more Australian-grown plant proteins in their formulations, but they are currently restricted by limited availability, format, or price. Removing this bottleneck is a really big opportunity to offer new value-adding streams for Australian agriculture, with the uses of plant proteins going well beyond the plant-based meat category and into products such as plant-based dairy, health foods, snacking, bakery, breads, cereals, and many more. And as I said earlier, Deloitte found that the agriculture sector was the largest indirect beneficiary of the plant-based meat's economic contribution. Both Deloitte and Food Frontier predict that this share could increase much further for the agricultural sector if we do see that increased domestic processing infrastructure for plant protein in Australia. Looking to the future. So in 2019, we asked Deloitte to project the market value for plant-based meat in Australia in 2030. And for this report, we asked Deloitte to check in how the industry is tracking on those 2019 projections. And given that those 2019 projections were made at a time of a lot of industry hype and excitement, they were made pre-COVID, pre-Ukraine, pre-inflation, we asked them to recalculate new 10-year projections out to 2033 based on the current market situation. So what this graph here shows is that looking at the previous 2030 scenarios, Deloitte compared the FY23 growth rates to the growth rates that would have been required to reach the 2030 scenarios. So we can see that in the right-hand side column. We can see that in almost all of them, the plant-based meat industry was not on track. So given these original projections were made at a time of increased investor hype, consumer excitement around the sector, and again, pre-COVID, it's not unexpected to see these figures were not quite there. However, based on that previous data set and the current economic factors, the slower than expected consumer uptake, market dynamics, et cetera, for the new 10-year projections out to 2033, Deloitte has scaled back the scenarios with the central scenario, scenario 2, now forecasting a market size of 1.65 billion by 2033, which is down from the 2019 estimate of 2.9 billion by 2030. I won't linger on this graph, but it is in the full report and also in the supplementary report that Simon mentioned earlier. It goes into more details about the projections for 2033 and the projections for specific sectors as well. So if this is of interest, I do recommend that you download that supplementary report. Now, this calculation looks at the potential economic contribution split by state at 2033. And this calculation from Deloitte assumes that the policy settings, support and production remains exactly the same as it was in FY23. And we know that it's going to change over time. We know it's going to fluctuate in future as state governments recognise the opportunity at hand in their own states to capitalise on plant-based meat and plant protein. So we do expect these figures will change. And who knows, hopefully we will see South Australia and Western Australia climbing up this table in the future. Okay, so path forward. From the highs of the pre-COVID projections, it's clear that the intervening economic, supply chain, societal pressures have all slowed consumer uptake to below the rates that were projected in 2019. And the challenge ahead for the industry is to gain adoption by the majority of consumers beyond the existing core of committed evangelists and early adopters. And something I do recommend you to take a look at that's not in our report is an explanation of the S-curve adoption from Synthesis Capital. They have a really great explanation of how the adoption curve fits in with other disruptive technologies. What can work to change to convert some of those early adopters into early converts and late converts is a growing awareness of food systems' role in climate change, and that's likely to influence some consumers to increase their consumption of plant-based foods and plant-based meats in particular. Similarly, Australia has been slower to act overall on the environmental sustainability of our food system compared to other nations, and this is anticipated to shift in the years ahead, particularly as Australia looks to the EU as a potential market. Now, here are the recommendations that we made for several sectors that are related, either working directly in the plant-based meat industry or surrounding. And I do recommend that if you are in one of those sectors that's named, that you take a look at the path forward section of the report, because we go into much more detail than we could fit onto these slides here, with much more explanations and a lot of evidence and citations as well to explain some of the things that we were trying to get across. So first of all, the most important takeaway for this report and for the industry is that taste and texture really needs to improve to increase consumer uptake. Secondly, price is key. Prices need to reduce as well to reduce that barrier for consumers. Something else that came up with some of our consultations is that it'd be great to see the industry prioritize convenience formats more. We know that it's something specifically that retailers are looking for. Retailers are really keen to increase customer awareness of these convenience formats. And in the last year, ready meals that contain plant-based meat have been the fastest growing category. So it's really interesting to see. And I think it's a really big opportunity for manufacturers who can work out how they can get plant-based meats and put them into those convenience format products. Also important is a focus on health and nutrition. Paradoxically, health is a key driver for consumption of plant-based meats, but it's also a really big barrier for a lot of people. And some of that goes to the misconceptions around health, and some of it goes to plant-based meat companies perhaps not being able to share or communicate their health benefits. And one of the key health benefits that I think is really underutilized at the moment is speaking to the benefits of fiber, which we know that plant-based meat products have, and they certainly have more than other products out there. So I'd really like to see in future, and it goes down to the second point below about improved consumer messaging. I'd really like to see fiber being spoken about more by the plant-based meat companies. Also, it can improve consumer messaging. It's really speaking to that value proposition of how to get consumers interested in what these products are offering to consumers. And finally, there's a lot of opportunities that are going to be on the horizon for blended and hybrid products. And what I mean by blended products are a mix of plant proteins and animal ingredients, conventional animal ingredients. And then hybrid products are a plant-based protein mixed with a cellular agriculture type of product. So cultivated meat or precision fermented fat. And as all of those technologies continue to scale, there'll be lots of opportunities there to see how those can improve nutrition, flavor, texture, mouthfeel, etc. Now, retailers. This is not going to be popular with the retailers to say, but one of the key things to reducing price is to reduce the margins that supermarkets require for plant-based meat products. We have been seeing overseas many retailers leading with a price parity or a price reduction strategy in order to increase consumer uptake of plant-based meats. So I would say that it's an opportunity for retailers to demonstrate support and market leadership in this space by reducing those margins where possible, and also considering the placement of plant-based meats and making sure they continue to arrange those in the same aisle as conventional meat. There are multiple studies now that show from both the US and the UK that placing plant-based meat in the conventional meat aisle, not mixed in with, but close to and next to conventional meats, does increase the uptake and the consumption and purchase of plant-based meat products with no impact on the sales of conventional meat. In terms of food service, I don't want to linger on this too much because we're going to have a great conversation shortly, but one thing I will speak to is the final point on menus. There's lots of research coming out now, and our report only spoke to it briefly about the potential of employing behavioural nudges on menus to increase consumer uptake by placing plant-based meats ahead of conventional meat and using taste-oriented descriptions to increase consumer uptake. In terms of agriculture, there are opportunities in plant protein ingredients, but we do need processing infrastructure to unlock this opportunity. For governments, demonstrating support for the sector through thought leadership and proactive sectoral engagement will engender confidence, both from the plant-based meat industry, but also investor confidence and investors who are looking at the sector. Co-investments can help with enabling scale-up platform infrastructure. In terms of scaling sectoral capacity, support for dedicated innovation hubs and R&D programs, as well as skills development and attraction. And finally, investors. So there is investment needed for infrastructure, both processing infrastructure and manufacturing infrastructure. And there are also investment opportunities in funding R&D. And I would urge investors to consider investment as a means to achieve sustainability outcomes, most importantly, highlighting the Boston Consulting Group's report that found that investments in plant-based meat lead to greater cuts in greenhouse gas emissions than other green investments. And that's it from me. So I do urge those of you that haven't had a chance to look at the report yet to please download it and take a look for yourselves in detail.
Thank you so much, Clara. And for those of you who have been asking questions about the slides, just a reminder in case you joined us late, we are recording the session and we will make available that recording. Most, if not all, of the data in that presentation is contained in our State of Industry report, so you can access that through downloading the report, and I'd urge you to do so. Finally, please don't forget to put your general questions and any questions for Adam after this session into the general chat function. We always get more questions than we have time to answer, so we'll look to try and do a bit of a consolidation around common themes. So at that point now, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to our Head of Industry Engagement, Susie O'Neill, who'll conduct our Q&A session with Adam Moore. And first of all, Susie, I'll ask you to introduce our distinguished guest.
Thanks so much, Simon. And Adam Moore actually needs little introduction to many of you, but I would like to acknowledge his expertise in the food service industry. Adam is ranked among the world's top corporate chefs, is a successful TV presenter, a successful author, and an esteemed culinary judge internationally. He began his chef's apprenticeship in hotel kitchens, working his way up through the ranks across many food service channels, gaining formal qualifications in pastry, charcuterie, and butchery, working in food styling and food photography along the way. Now, with 32 years in the industry to his credit, Adam has worked across food service in multiple commercial and institutional settings in retail, food manufacturing, marketing, and sales, and with a who's who of past employers, including Mars Australia, George Weston Foods, Suntory, Kraft Heinz, Plant-Based Proform Foods, to name only a few. He currently describes himself as a culinologist and leads organisations in consumer-led recipe development, capturing culinary trends, new product development, and food innovation consulting. Adam is also a Research Chefs Association certified executive chef, a member of the Australian Institute of Food Scientists, and an active member of the Global Research Chefs Association. And he is a renowned industry mentor for young chefs. Adam has just co-authored a new book based on his very personal experience of weight loss called Not a Bariatric Cookbook. And with another book about to launch on teaching people how to cook, he has never been busier. We've invited Adam here today to explore the opportunity identified in food service for plant-based meats in a bit more detail. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Susie. That's a bit of a mouthful for you. I do apologise. Thank you, Simon and Clara, for a wonderful presentation before. So it's great to be here, Susie.
Fantastic. Adam, could we start with you telling us something about you that we don't already know?
Yeah, that's always a hard one because most things people can find online. There's three things. I've broken 3 Guinness World Records in food in my time, which is great. And 2 of them have now been broken, which is great. I'm going to have to rejoin them again. And the other one, probably more recently, I have lost over 92 kilos in the last 12 months. And it's been a very personal journey, and it has really taken me to a different level in my career and where I am today. So that's probably it.
Fantastic. And I know that you've said to me that your phone has not stopped ringing. So that's wonderful as well.
It's good to see so many the viewers on this, people that I know very well and respect very well. So it's lovely to see that too.
Fantastic. Adam, the Australian food service market was estimated to be worth $48 billion in 2022, with nearly 80,000 outlets, roughly 70-30 between commercial and institutional channels. Yes. And we know from Food Industry Foresight's research a couple of years ago that 80% of the plant-based meat products in the commercial sector was sold through QSRs. Where do you see the biggest opportunity for growth within, but also outside of QSR channels?
It's a great question, Susie. Look, let's look at it this way. Australia's got the most complex food service system in the world. And when I say that, it's broken into so many different chunks. When we look at our QSR market here, it's quite strong. But when you look internationally, QSR's normally leading the food service sectors. But what we have here in Australia, you have a mixture of HORECA, which is hotels, restaurants, cafes, institutional, industrial, of course, QSR, and now one that has kind of broken away from a mainstream one, which is aged care. Aged care, we're seeing the largest portfolio that's broken away from institutional, and aged care is seeing the most amount of retirees that this country's ever seen. Now, post the Royal Commission on the aged care sector, there was only a small paragraph about the food in aged care, which is quite disconcerting because aged care is probably one of the biggest growth areas at the moment. You've seen a lot of chefs transition to aged care, and I think aged care is going to be the vehicle going forward. We also have a lot of baby boomers that are retiring, that have an eclectic palate, have traveled the world, and are looking at healthier lifestyles. So the aged care sector, whether it be retirement homes, aged care facilities, aged care living places, or even over 55-year-old living spaces, it's the area that needs the most attention right now. And although QSR's fantastic and everyone wants a QSR, but a QSR can take up to 18 months to 2 years to land a product. Maybe that's just for an LTO, like a limited time offer. But whereas aged care, there is different rulings across the different states. But one of the good things about plant-based food, you can get fortification products, which actually benefit a lot of the aged care sector at the moment. So I think that's the biggest area of growth. But it is, don't go rushing there tomorrow and going, I'm going to go get an aged care. You've got to do a few steps to get into an aged care first and make sure you're doing the right thing, especially when we've got nutritionists and doctors online as well. Really understand your market. And I think that's the whole thing with food service, Susie, is understanding who you're going after. Don't just go in there and think, I've got a one size plus all fits everything. Understand who you're going after. And that's probably the biggest insight that you can get straight away in food service.
Fantastic, Adam. So if we use that, understand who you're going after, chef training and education, I know, is one of your passions. If we're going after training and educating chefs on how to use plant-based meat products and plant-forward cooking, how do we best ensure that chefs are knowledgeable about plant-based products and specifically plant-based meat products?
It's a great question because we've got two things happening at the moment. Outside of COVID, yes, I did say that word. Unfortunately, the hospitality or the food service sector has had probably one of the hardest and roughest transitions outside of any financial or economical remit. And normally, food service is the first industry to bounce back from any dip from a recession or anything like that. But at the moment, we've lost so many chefs. At the moment, there's approximately 120,000 chefs in this country now working across 80,000 venues, as you mentioned before. There's about 40,000 cooks, and there's about 20,000 unknown, so people that are not qualified but are working in the space. That could be, kitchen hands or kitchen prep. And we're going through the most intense skill shortages the country has ever seen in decades. And it's interesting, even during COVID, we lost 1/3 of chefs out of the industry completely. So chefs went to other industries, left completely. I know chefs that have gone to, everything from medical, going to supply chain, and really transitioning out. The other scary thing is during those 4 years of COVID, our apprenticeship rates dropped dramatically. Now, that's scary because we have a 30 to 40% dropout rate of young chefs anyway. but we didn't have any chefs getting supported. And unfortunately, when the governments didn't support young kids coming through, it really slowed things down. So there's a couple of things, though, that's been positive. The industry of food service is at a growth rate at 14%. Now, some of the questions coming through about, closures and things like that at the moment, and some of the questions I got earlier today, yes, there's been a lot of profile chefs closing businesses. There's been some businesses close, but for every business that closed, another 2 opened their doors. So right now, Australia's got a lot of things positive happening at the moment, especially with tourism in this country, especially when the Sydney airport will open in 2 years' time, the second airport, which will be a 24/7. The amount of restaurants, and I live out not far from that airport out in the western suburbs, and the amount of restaurants that are opening, massive. I know there's a lot of investment going into restaurants. There's a couple of things happening, though. The TAFE system, or the education system, hasn't caught up with all the trends of what's happening now. And just to give you light of that, last year was the very first time that TAFEs in Australia started teaching vegetarian and veganism in schools. So right up until then, it was a very small little subject. It wasn't even a subject, it was kind of hidden away in the pages. And what's scary about that was they haven't really taught it for such a long time, and yet it's been around for a good 10, 15 years, established markets, but chefs weren't trained in that space. So what has happened, the government has changed that process at the moment, but it's vegan and vegetarian, but it doesn't include plant-based mediums. It doesn't include, even things like really basic, simple vegetarian dishes from vegetable-based products. So that is quite concerning. Now, why I say educate and train, there's a couple of things you need to look at. You can't just train the chef. You need to train the chef and venue. You need to train the distributor or wholesaler, and you also need to train the customer. So there's 3 factors that need to happen. And why I say train or educate, when you look at companies like Nestle or Fonterra, Nestle runs the oldest cooking competition in Australia, 57 years now of Golden Chef Plate, which is about encouraging young chefs and educate. When you really think about what Nestle is doing, and if Nestle is on this, have done a really good job of educating about their consumer-led products or end-user products in their market, but using the chefs to use it in their competition. Also, Fonterra has a competition called Proud to be a Chef. It's been running for over 20 odd years. I was very lucky to be Bonlac Proud to be a Chef when it first started, and then Fonterra acquired that. And again, it's about educating young people and moving products forward. And Susie and I have had lots of conversations outside of this. A great example in New South Wales of educating and changing chefs' perception was a company called Korea Crush, which still exists today. And Korea Crush is about spice mixes and spices. And one of the things that they did really well in the 70s and 80s, they actually gave all the schools every piece of herb and spice that you can imagine from Korea Crush in the orange canisters. And what's interesting about that, every chef that went through TAFE used Korea Crush herbs and spices. And when they went into their venues, they used it. And that's where the brand Korea Crush really grew, by that subliminal marketing and understanding the end user and understanding the training that goes on behind there. This is important because we talk about, I mentioned, understand the client or the person that you're chasing, but understand and listen. Don't just assume that you know everything about their business. You need to find the solutions to fix the problems, and don't assume what they do. Understand how they cook it in a kitchen. As we said, you've got hotels, restaurants, cafes, institutional. Are they using a brat pan? Are they using a combi oven? Are they steaming it? Understanding how your product works and reacts in there is going to change the whole perception of what you do. The other thing there is, we mentioned about competitions with companies like Nestle and Fonterra. They do it really well. If anyone is going to the plant-based space, definitely when you're sponsoring a competition, don't just go, oh, we've got their name on the logos and everything's all great and we move on. Educate the chefs, before they go and do the competition. Because if you don't educate in your product and the chef doesn't know how to use it, it's really, first of all, it's a waste of money that you just spent advertising your brand. The chefs get a bad reaction to the product, and then they go, I'm not going to use that in my business. So what do? They swap out the idea of plant-based mediums, and they go, what can I do? If you educate from the ground up, it changes everything. I mentioned about the distributor or wholesaler. We have one of the largest, most complex distributor networks in the world. And essentially, and some distributors are essentially box movers. We need to make sure that we educate. And someone just asked, what are the biggest barriers to food service incorporating plant-based meats? It's exactly this: training people. Don't just put in a distributor and hope that the distributor is going to sell it. Some of those distributor reps have up to 60,000 lines that they need to focus on. So if you don't have a big sales team, use your distributor network to really educate them, educate the sales team to be an extension of your sales team, but also educate the chefs. Don't go, oh, my menu, this is going on the menu, this is what it should be, put a bolognese on now. Understand what you're trying to fix. And the other thing is too, if you're really presenting a food service product for plant-based, definitely go in there with the knowledge of how do I use that product more often, more frequently. So for example, if I used a plant-based mince, how many times can I use that on a menu? Is it on lunchtime? Is it on breakfast? Is it on dinner? Is it on entree? Is it on main? Can I stretch it to, functions? How many times can I use it? Because then you get bigger volumes by selling that more. The chefs are more inclined to use it. There is a bit of a resistance with chefs coming on board at the moment, because we did, over the last 5 years, have lots of products come into the market, and we had some really terrible products from overseas. And I'll say that there was some E numbers and lots of high sodiums, but there was some amazing, great Australian products that were here that were trying to challenge and get into the space. And they've already had a bad resistance, because some of the products that had the E numbers or had horrible taste, people went, oh no, I don't want that. So therefore the industry said, no, we don't want it. If we would look at it as a positive and change it around, how do I go in there? Understand your product before you walk into that room, and understand a menu. One of the tricks that I used to do in sales is, before I walked into a restaurant, I looked at the menu and identified how many times my items could go on a menu. And that shows the challenge. The other thing here, and this is a non-branded message, this is kind of touches brand, but I always used to say, do the Pepsi challenge. Those that are old enough to see the Pepsi commercials where they used to say, is Coke better or Pepsi better? The Pepsi challenge is getting your product and saying to a chef, now understanding chefs are short-skilled, they're time pressured at the moment. So understanding that and going, guys, okay, you make yours from scratch, but I have a solution. How do I sell it into you? Try my product. It's going to save you time. It's going to save you cost. It's going to save you wastage. So understand those, and those little mechanisms really push that forward in this industry. There's a couple of little nuggets in there. The training is probably the key one, if anyone that does it properly. And when you look at similar industries, seafood, meat industry, they train, and retrain. And they spend a lot of money making sure that their product is cooked properly, is presented the best way, and definitely on menu each and every time.
Adam,
Yes.
That's about 4 of my questions, all
Oh,
rolled up into one, and incredible insights and answers. Thank you so much for that. I've got a really quick question before we throw to the audience.
Yes.
Which is, in a nutshell, where will plant-based meat products be performing best in 2033?
What a great question. Having coming from the plant-based space, I'm very passionate about it, and working with some of the best people in the world in this space that are passionate, enthusiastic about it. I see that plant-based mediums will have a very strong future. It's just getting through those little barriers, understanding, if you educate the chefs that are struggling at the moment, you're going to really start to shine. And I think plant-based, we've also got in the back wings, cellular agriculture coming in the back wings. That again is going through a renaissance. I think the plant-based space, if you look at the gluten-free industry 10 years ago, we had similarities where a lot of the gluten-free products were terrible. Now I think the gluten-free market is established. Those that have, the Australian brands that have actually worked really hard on ensuring gluten-free is phenomenal. That is, if you look at a like-for-like industry, gluten-free was at one stage, and it's really interesting, 2/3 of people that eat a gluten-free diet at the moment actually aren't gluten intolerant or don't have an allergy in gluten. They see it as a diet, or I'm getting my carbs down. So it's quite interesting. And the amount of work and the innovation, Australian innovation, that has gone behind gluten-free, I think is some of the best in the world. And, I've had gluten-free pizzas recently, which were absolutely unbelievable, like a true sourdough. I've seen gluten-free products really grow. So I think plant-based could assimilate very similar to the gluten-free industry. Those that are in the market at the moment, and those are on the call that are innovating Australian products, understand your product, put it out there, and I think you're going to have a very strong future. Yes, the industry is a bit hard at the moment, but staying course and keeping Australian would be awesome. Keeping Australian innovation also creates jobs here in this country, and plant-based will definitely shine through. If you educate your chefs, it'll be on the menus a lot more in a bigger category.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Adam. I've got a lot more questions if we have time, but I'm going to throw to Simon now, where he's going to open the audience Q&A. So some of the questions will obviously be going to you, but thank you so much for your incredible insights today on the call.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. I'll reiterate that. I knew there was a good reason why we wanted you on the webinar. That was absolutely fabulous. But we have had a couple of questions around the recent news about Australian plant proteins. And those of you on the call who haven't heard, a week ago, it was announced that APP had gone into voluntary administration. So just for the record, just to give people some information, APP is the only Australian-based manufacturer of high-quality Australian-grown fava bean and pulse protein isolates. It already supplies local and international food manufacturers. So that announcement shouldn't be seen as a failure of an individual company, but it's really a warning that building a long-term sustainable industry takes time, a lot of ongoing investment, particularly in upfront capex, and commitment from the whole sector. This is especially important in regional areas. APP is based in Horsham, where employment and value-added industries are desperately needed. So plant-based protein production is a sustainable industry. It benefits our consumers, it benefits our primary producers, it benefits the environment. So Food Frontier is positively supportive of continued attempts to invest in this crucial area. And as we've reported in our SOI report, there is probably requirement for at least 10 facilities and groups such as APP around the country. So this is a temporary setback, and we're doing everything we can to find out more information. So at that point, I'll focus on some of the questions that have pretty much dealt with similar issues. And I'm going to go straight to one about the ultra processing of these foods, knowing that Clara has just come back from Bridge to Food, where she was an esteemed panelist talking about ultra processed foods. We do have a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding with the assumption that these foods are very high in sodium, that they're very high in saturated fat, particularly coconut oil and so on. Clara, why don't you give us some commentary, because we have done our own report and published some years ago on the nutritional benefits and comparisons, but what the very best of plant-based meat is doing in this space against these criticisms of ultra processing.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Yeah, you're right. We published at the time the world's first analysis of plant-based meat products in direct comparison to their conventional meat counterparts. So that's sausage for sausage, burger for burger. And we looked at the nutrients that were available in the pack to determine, which had what the nutrient values were. And what we could see is that there was equivalent protein, but much lower saturated fat and much lower, surprisingly, sodium than their conventional counterparts. And that was across all the categories, except for one, I believe. For anyone who's interested in that report, it's available for free on our website. And interestingly enough, the George Institute followed up with a pretty much identical survey or identical study in a year later with a bigger sample size, and they had almost exactly the same findings, that plant-based meat products have lower saturated fat and lower sodium than the conventional counterparts. And what they also found, interestingly, about the George Institute study is they look at the proportion of products that would be considered ultra-processed if you use the NERVA classification term. And I don't particularly like that classification tool, because it's not a tool that allows you to analyze a product based on its nutrition. It simply tells you if a product is processed or not processed. It doesn't tell you anything about whether that the product is healthy, unhealthy, what kind of nutrients it has. And what they found in their report was that the amount of products on shelves that are considered ultra processed or moderately processed was relatively the same between plant-based meat products and conventional meat products. So I can't remember the exact details, but I remember it was within a few percent of products. So although people see these sensationalist media headlines about articles, and they're generally from journalists who have read the press release about a study but not actually read the study, who are jumping to conclusions saying that, or considering that ultra processing means that something is unhealthy, what it tells you is that people are potentially considering that plant-based products are uniquely ultra processed. But the fact remains that the majority of our food system is ultra processed, and also the majority of conventional meat products on shelves that are bacon, salamis, hams, they are all ultra processed as well. If we want to use that, if we want to continue using the same definition, it's not a unique thing to plant-based meat products. And again, it doesn't tell us anything specific about the nutritional health of these products. So what we do need is a lot more research done in this field. We need a lot more nuance when speaking about food. And what I would like to see is, if people are going to use the term ultra processed to classify a food, they also need to use another nutritional metric as well, that allows you to assess the nutrition content of a food. And I'm speaking so much about this because I actually studied nutrition. I'm a nutritionist by trade initially, which is why I do have, I guess, a lot of thoughts and feelings about this topic.
Thanks, Clara. Next question I'm going to ask both of you to comment on, and it's come from one of our participants. And, and Clara has got some clear observations from our recent trip to Europe. And we know that in European countries like Germany, 1 in 5 burgers sold in their fast food joints is a plant-based burger. Somebody's asked the question, given, and I won't name names, one of our major fast food chains that hasn't gone that route. Is there something about Australia, or are there particular barriers as to why we're not seeing that kind of uptake? We're seeing it in America, perhaps, of putting plant-based burgers as alternatives into those fast food chain restaurants, or even looking at alternatives in some of the chicken-based fast food restaurants. Clara, why don't you just give us some commentary back on your experience in Europe, and then I'll flip to Adam, for both of you, for a very quick response to what you think might the barriers be.
There's a few barriers. I know that the largest fast food chain in Australia did trial a plant-based meat option last year, I believe, and they, I believe, haven't decided to go ahead with it. But just because they don't do it, we do still see some great examples of Hungry Jack's and also Grilled really flying the flag for including plant-based meat alternatives on their menu. It was really gratifying to see that there are plant-based meat alternative options all throughout Europe whilst I was there, especially in the Netherlands. And the reason for that, I personally think, is just it's a bigger market size. And so companies are probably concentrating on those markets first because it's potentially easier, or they can see their eyes on a bigger prize, and they might see the Australian market as a bit smaller. But what I would like to remind them is that Australia is one of the fastest growing markets for plant-based products and for interest in plant-based foods and plant-based diets. So I think when the products are there and the options are there, the sales will follow.
Adam?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. If you look at the Australian footprint in QSR, we normally only have limited machines or limited, cooking apparatuses that we can use. So some places that have tried plant-based are cooking it alongside with meat items as well. Whereas if you do go to America, they can have multiple grills and they can actually dedicate. It's almost like gluten-free as well. Having a dedicated gluten-free deep fryer, it's quite expensive to do in the footprint. And I think in the volume too, there's a couple of things there. We haven't educated the end user how to do it and how to order. And then when you look at the menus are quite complex, and you go in there and you want something quick and fast. There's no education behind it. So there's a couple of things there. Whereas if you do walk into, America or Europe, you do see education about the plant-based offerings that are on menu.
Great. I mean, and staying with you for a moment, Adam.
Yes.
We eat in groups. We eat in families. We eat with friends. We go out and dine in groups and families and friends. We all have different dietary requirements. What are the key things we can do, particularly in QSRs and others, around providing for that diversity? You talk about people needing gluten-free diets and various other things. How might those restaurants and cafes, etc., cater in a way that is, inviting people to try things rather than just catering for the one with the preferences?
I think what a great question, because there's a couple of things you can look at here. When I did my weight loss journey, I included a lot more plant-based into my diet and become more of a flexitarian, because I don't have a stomach to process meat as it is. So I started changing my diet. But I think if you include plant-based mediums, maybe, not saying that as a plant-based option as well, you still have to put it in there, word it in that way. But, one of the things I've seen work really well is using your plant-based options as your allergens and things like that. So if you're gluten-free, if you're nut-free, if you're soy-free, there's a good option of putting it forward. So it's all your allergens all ticked off, your vegetarian, vegan kicked off, and you're more inclined. And it's interesting. There's companies like Made by Cade who does falafel, which is really interesting, because then everyone can still eat that and really enjoy that. I think also making sure that you have amazing accompaniments to go with the dishes. So companies like Proform Foods have fantastic minces, but making sure that putting the right seasonings and herbs in there, and really getting everyone to enjoy a fantastic mince-based dish that is plant-based, but maybe not calling out plant-based. So there's a couple of options there, I think, because once one person takes it, and you're in group, if they see that, dad starts eating and is enjoying it, then everyone at the table will also enjoy it. So, sometimes not making a big song and dance about it can make a big difference. And it's interesting. I've learned that with educating young kids when they're eating, I don't like vegetables. I don't like that. Sometimes hiding it, sometimes, making it more inventive or in fun ways. And the best one right now is, tacos. You could have tacos or bao buns, have it on the table. Everyone can make their own, and everyone's sharing and enjoying at the same time. Remember, food is a memory and an occasion, and it's about those moments of sharing. That's probably the best way of enticing that in.
Fabulous. I'm going to ask one last question, with both of you having an opportunity to comment on it. We see a very different whole environment in places like Europe, with greater competition. The UK and other European countries with 6, 7, 8 supermarket chains, some of them positively trying to compete with each other on their environmental credentials, and therefore, like Lidl in Germany, for example, offering all of their plant-based offerings at price parity with others. So they've made that conscious choice. So I'm going to ask both of you for your opinion in driving this forward and trying to push change. Are we really relying on, I'll let you pick one of these, although that might be a bit simplistic. Are we really looking at the requirement for government regulation and incentivization? Or is it really down, as Clara requested, different retail strategies and retailers wanting to invest in this space for all sorts of messaging, say sustainability? Or is it down to further investment, development of the ingredient supply, the whole ecosystem and chain? Is it around institutional food and getting big changes in people in hospitals, in aged care? Pick one. It's a bit formulaic, but pick one. Why don't you go first, Clara, and we'll finish with Adam.
Pick one. I'll just comment and say that it's very difficult in Australia with a very concentrated retail market. What's possible in Europe is not necessarily possible here in the Netherlands. There's a group that rates these supermarkets on their sustainability, and part of their key strategies for increasing the sustainability of their supply chain was to increase the provision of plant-based products on shelves. And by doing so, they were able to move higher up the sustainability ranking, and all the supermarkets act to try and get to the top of the sustainability ranking so they can be the top, and I think that helps them win customers over. So I think it's not regulation, but it's encouragement from consumers that I think could actually be key here. But ultimately, it's educating the consumer to know that's important as well. Adam?
I think if I really had to pick one right now, I would say ESG is probably the most important topic of Australia in the next 10 years. That environmental, social, and governance. I think if you've got the accreditation, if you haven't, go get it. I think if you have a great story, tell it. And if you're an Australian producer producing amazing innovation, then sing it from the rooftops, because we need to not only support Australian industries, which support Australian jobs, but we also need to make sure that there's a sustainable message there, that everyone can have that footprint. And I think if you take ESG, the government's really looking at ESG going forward in the future and what that looks like. And a lot of corporate companies have had to put ESG statements in the last 18 months. I think if you go that angle, it's really going to help the plant-based industry a lot stronger.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Clara. Thank you, Susie. We're right on time. And thank everybody who has joined and participated in what I think has been a fabulous webinar. Don't forget, if you'd like to help and support Food Frontier, head to our website. Donations are tax deductible. It's that time of the year. You've got a few days left to give us some support. We're the only independent charity in our region specifically focused on the entirety of the alternative protein supply ecosystem. Don't forget, a copy of the State of the Industry Report's available on our website. There has been a link in the chat if you haven't seen it already. And Proteins 24, our major conference every year that was a spectacular success the last 2 years. And anybody on the call who has attended it will testify to that. But if you didn't come and haven't been, you really should come, because everything All Proteins is up for show on our one day at the Sofitel Hotel on October the 10th. And finally, early bird discounted tickets are still available on our website, but only for a couple more days. So following that, it's really only time to mention that this has been recorded, as I've said. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and a survey. Please do take very few moments just to fill in that survey. I do hope this has been a valuable webinar and you've thoroughly enjoyed it. And thanks again to our guests and all of our attendees. And bye for now. Have a great day and a great weekend.